The judge leaned forward and snapped, "You'll speak when I say so." They thought she was a clerk, or maybe just lost. But the silence after that said otherwise. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just opened her folder slowly. The bailiff stepped closer, the gavel hit once, then again, but before the third strike, someone finally read her name. The room shifted, chairs creaked, and the judge's eyes stopped on a single word. But he never finished the sentence. Before we begin this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you believe that justice should never depend on the color of someone's skin, press like and subscribe right now, because what happens next will shake every courtroom in the country, and tomorrow's special episode will go even deeper. They thought she was a mistake. That's how it always started. The heavy courtroom door creaked behind her as she stepped in, careful not to draw too much attention. She held a simple black folder close to her chest and walked silently down the center aisle, her heels quiet against the marbled floor. Every seat was filled with attorneys, court clerks, law students, and public observers. No one turned to look, not even once, except the man in the robe, Judge Caldwell. He leaned back in his seat, glasses resting at the tip of his nose, and stared at her like she'd just interrupted something sacred. The moment she stood still near the counsel tables, the gavel came down. Not once, but twice, sharp and final. "Step aside," he said without looking at her again. "You're not on the docket." His voice was dry, irritated, like this had happened to him before, and he'd had enough. She didn't move. She simply nodded respectfully and raised her hand, silently requesting permission to speak. It only made things worse. The bailiff, a young white man with a buzz cut, walked straight up to her, placing a hand near his hip holster, as if her silence was a threat. "You need to move," he said under his breath. "You're not supposed to be here." No one in the courtroom objected. A few even chuckled. Behind her, a woman in a gray pencil skirt whispered, "Maybe she's lost. Or maybe she's just here to watch someone she knows go down." There it was. The first layer. Personal disrespect. A woman of color who entered a courtroom without explanation must have no business there. But that wasn't the end of it, because what happened next exposed a much deeper layer. The court reporter stopped typing. The clerk in charge of scheduling furrowed her brow, then leaned in to whisper something to the judge. Papers shuffled. The judge looked down, searching through documents, unable to find her name. And in that moment, her presence became more than inconvenient. It became a procedural threat, a disruption of order, systemic dismissal. The law had no room for those who did not pre-register, pre-authorize, or pre-exist within its paperwork. She remained still, hand raised, folder closed. But now the court had turned on her fully. "Escort her out," the judge said, motioning toward the door. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't angry, it was just cold, detached, as if she wasn't even worth his time. The bailiff nodded. 2 steps forward. No resistance from her. Just a calm look in his eyes. Then came the third layer, the one they wouldn't realize until much later. Behind her, sitting silently in the far back corner, a young law intern watched the entire exchange. Her expression changed. Her hand reached into her own folder, and without saying a word, she began writing something down. The hallway echoed with the sound of her heels as the bailiff escorted her out. The door closed behind them with a dull, final thud. Inside, no one asked where she had gone. No one asked why she had been there in the first place. But outside that door, standing against the beige wall under a flickering light, she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at the bailiff and asked if she could speak with the clerk. He narrowed his eyes and radioed someone, then told her to wait. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Finally, the clerk emerged, a white woman in her late 50s, hair tightly pulled back, glasses swinging from a chain around her neck. The clerk didn't smile. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply said, "You're not on any list. If you have business here, you need to file a request through the regional admin's office." The woman nodded. "May I show you a letter?" she asked calmly. The clerk sighed and took the black folder she offered. She flipped it open. "Read." 3 lines, then stopped. Her eyes darted up, then down again. She blinked twice, and suddenly her voice softened. "Wait here," she said, and walked quickly back inside. 5 minutes later, the same bailiff returned. This time, he didn't touch her arm. He just said, "The judge will allow you to observe from the back." She walked in again, this time, slower, deliberately, but as she passed the rows of polished chairs, the smirks returned. One lawyer near the plaintiff's table nudged his colleague and muttered, "Back again. Persistent little thing, isn't she?" Another turned and grinned. "Maybe she thinks this is a library." Their voices weren't loud, but they were meant to be heard. It wasn't just the dismissal of a stranger. It was the spectacle of it. A courtroom full of professionals watching a black woman in a simple navy suit being shuffled around as if she didn't know where she belonged. The judge didn't even acknowledge her return. He continued speaking as if nothing had happened. A case involving wrongful termination was being heard. A Latina woman sat with her lawyer at the defense table, face pale and hands clenched. The judge questioned the timeline of her termination with irritation. He called a recess and stood up, leaving the courtroom in silence. The woman in the navy suit remained in the back, eyes locked on every face. She took no notes, she said nothing, but the weight of her silence began to press down on the air. The intern in the back noticed it too. She had returned to her seat, fingers typing furiously on her tablet, her glances bouncing between the woman in blue and the documents she had downloaded. When court resumed, the judge returned with a mug in hand. He leaned back, called on the next witness, and still never looked at her. As the witness took the stand, the woman in blue shifted slightly forward, just enough to be noticed. But once again, her presence was ignored. And this time, the laughter returned in quiet waves. One by one, they came. Whispered comments, raised eyebrows, shrugging shoulders. One lawyer leaned over and asked the court clerk, "Does she even have credentials? Or is this just some affirmative action visitor tour?" The clerk didn't respond, but she didn't stop it either. That moment became the first public fracture, the visible breaking point where not just one person, but an entire courtroom participated in a humiliation wrapped in civility. It looked like procedure, but it felt like contempt, and she said nothing. She didn't need to, because something had already shifted. The intern's notes were no longer just academic, they had become documentation, a record, and the gavel had not yet struck for the last time. The witness had barely finished her third sentence when Judge Caldwell lifted a hand. "We'll move on," he said flatly, cutting off the testimony mid-thought. The room fell quiet again. Papers shuffled. Someone coughed. But the atmosphere remained tight, unwelcoming, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the judge glanced toward the back and narrowed his eyes. "That woman is still seated here?" he asked, not even bothering to use her name. "Is she on the list now?" The court clerk froze. She didn't speak. The judge turned to the bailiff. "I thought I gave an instruction." The bailiff stepped forward again. She was cleared. "To observe, sir," he said carefully. "By whom?" Caldwell snapped. "If she's not a participant, she does not sit in this courtroom." The bailiff hesitated. The woman in the navy suit stood slowly, placing her folder under one arm. "I was told," she began, but the judge's gavel came down again, louder this time. "You will not speak. Leave. Now." That was the second time she had been silenced. But this time, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, a direct act of exclusion. The personal layer stung again, sharp and clear. She was spoken to like a child, like a trespasser. Then came the deeper cut, the systemic rot. Without verifying her identity, without reading a single line from the documents she carried, the court had decided she was irrelevant. Procedure bent, not around fact, but familiarity, comfort, assumption. She walked to the aisle, head held high, but before she reached the door, someone laughed. A high-pitched snort from the plaintiff's side, then a whisper behind her, "Second time today. Maybe she's just looking for attention." Another voice added, "Or maybe she's hoping someone in here will validate her little resume." She kept walking. Each word was a drop in a slow-burning fire. The third layer settled in with quiet finality. The influence of humiliation didn't stop at her. The young Latina woman at the defense table glanced up, saw her leaving, and looked down at her lap, the color draining from her face. The intern, in the back, swallowed hard, fingers frozen on the keyboard. Even the stenographer hesitated for a beat before continuing her transcript. This wasn't just a slight against one woman. It was a signal to every silent observer that voice and place still had a price tag, one that not everyone was allowed to pay. As the courtroom door shut behind her once more, she stopped in the hallway, not moving for a full minute. Not out of confusion, not out of fear, but calculation. She pulled out her phone, tapped 3 times, and waited. A screen blinked, a secure connection opened, and a quiet voice on the other end asked, "Are you ready to file formal notice?" She stared at the courtroom door, then answered with one word, "Not yet." She didn't always speak softly. There was a time when her voice ran sharp with anger, when her fists clenched before her mind caught up, but the world taught her quickly. Being loud didn't work when the room had already decided not to hear you. She learned that as a girl, walking into the public library in Montgomery with her mother. The security guard didn't ask her name. He just pointed to the children's section and said, "That way. The rest is for students only." She had been 10 years old and already reading at a high school level. Her mother didn't argue. She simply took her hand and walked them both to the shelves labeled youth. That was the first time she felt it, the shrinking of space, the quiet denial of access. Later, in law school, it became a pattern. Professors who skipped her when hands were raised. Study groups that forgot to send her the location. Internships that said yes in interviews but never followed up in writing. And then, when she graduated top of her class, the most prestigious firms told her she would be a better fit in community defense. It was never about credentials, it was about comfort. Theirs, not hers. She chose not to play their game. Instead of chasing approval, she disappeared into the walls of the system, building a path in oversight and compliance, learning how courts operated from the inside out. She took positions that no one paid attention to. Policy auditor, internal affairs liaison, subcommittee advisor. But with each quiet role, she grew more powerful, not in title, in access, in information. In consequence, she'd reviewed more judicial misconduct files than most attorneys read in a decade. She didn't take the podium. She stayed in the room after everyone left. She waited for when it mattered most. Her decision to visit the Caldwell courtroom hadn't been random, it had been tracked for 6 months. Multiple community complaints, unusual dismissal patterns, 3 appeals overturned quietly. She didn't walk in that day to be seen. She walked in to observe silently and trigger a procedural review, but they couldn't even let her sit. The irony wasn't lost on her. Years of choosing invisibility only to be stripped of even that. But it didn't shake her. She had learned one thing above all: the system may silence individuals, but it listens to pressure. And pressure doesn't speak. It moves, quietly, strategically, and when it strikes, it leaves no room for denial. As she stood in the hallway outside courtroom 3B, memories of 1,000 doors closing flickered across her mind. Not one of those doors stayed shut forever. They only required the right key. And in her hand, inside the folder pressed to her chest, that key was already printed, signed, and authorized. She just needed to decide when to use it. She waited 30 hours before returning, not because she was afraid, not because she doubted her authority, but because timing was everything. She chose the second day of testimony, knowing the court would be thinner, less guarded, and Judge Caldwell would be further along in his routine. She dressed with the same precision. No jewelry, navy again, a fresh black folder with 3 tabs, marked in red. As she stepped through security, the guards barely looked up. Her ID was presented again, this time with a formal letter from the State Oversight Bureau. The clerk who accepted it paused for less than 2 seconds before stamping it and handing it back. She made her way through the corridor to courtroom 3B. No one stopped her, no one challenged her. She opened the door quietly and took the same seat as before. This time, no gavel fell, but the judge noticed. He didn't say anything, not yet. The hearing continued, a witness describing events that had unfolded between employees of the city's housing department. But 20 minutes in, Judge Caldwell called for a sidebar. Voices lowered. Attorneys approached the bench, and the clerk stood and walked directly to her. "The judge has asked you to wait outside," she said, eyes not meeting hers. "On what basis?" the woman asked calmly. The clerk hesitated, then said, "There was no record of your name in the participation log, and you did not request an observation slot for today." The woman nodded once. Then she opened the black folder and turned it around, revealing the document inside. "Please read section 3, she said. The clerk's lips parted as she skimmed the lines, her throat catching for a second. Then, without a word, the clerk walked back to the bench. The judge looked annoyed, angry even, but he said nothing. The lawyers returned to their positions. The clerk sat, the woman remained. 15 more minutes passed before the tension snapped. Judge Caldwell interrupted the witness mid-response, looked directly at the woman in navy, and asked, "Are you planning to speak today, or just continue taking up space?" No one moved. The court fell still. The witness glanced at her, confused. The attorneys froze. The woman didn't respond. She simply closed the folder. The judge exhaled loudly. "This court has procedures," he said. "If you're here as part of a press stunt or oversight theater, I suggest you file proper paperwork. Otherwise, you will be escorted out again." There was no raise in his voice, no shouting, but the intent was unmistakable. It wasn't about legality, it was about power. The personal attack landed sharp and loud. The institutional layer ran deeper. Once again, her name had not been used. Her role had not been acknowledged. Procedure was selectively applied to exclude, not protect. And this time, it came with a third edge. One of quiet threat. As she left her seat and stepped toward the rear, the bailiff intercepted her. He didn't touch her, but he leaned in close enough for no one else to hear, and whispered, "If you come back again, we'll put it in writing. Disturbance of court protocol, you'll be flagged. And I don't care what badge you flashed then." That wasn't a warning, it was a line in the sand. Personal, procedural, and now dangerous. She didn't flinch. She didn't answer. She simply turned and walked out of courtroom 3B for the third time. But this time, the intern in the back followed her. And this time, the court's silence felt a little less secure. She didn't stop at the lobby. She didn't stop at the sidewalk. She walked 4 blocks to a small legal cope nestled between an insurance office and a faded laundromat. A place where paper records still mattered and printers hummed constantly. She stepped inside and was greeted with a nod by the receptionist who knew her by face but not by name. Upstairs, behind a glass door marked Closed Case Archives, she pulled out a specific binder, opened to page 17, and photographed 2 signatures. Then she sent an encrypted message with those photos to a secure line labeled Fed Oversight C Response. After that, she disappeared for 20 hours. The court moved on. A day passed. The hearing continued. Witnesses cycled in and out. Lawyers maneuvered, and Judge Caldwell acted like she had never existed, until she returned again, once more seated quietly in the rear of courtroom 3B. This time, she wasn't alone. A young attorney walked in beside her, suited in charcoal gray, holding nothing but a yellow legal pad and a stare that dared anyone to speak first. They said nothing, took no notes, just watched. This time, the courtroom didn't mock her. No whispers, no laughter, only stolen glances and the shifting of weight in chairs that had grown too warm with the heat of speculation. Then it happened. Midday, during a brief recess, someone posted a story, a local courthouse blog. Nothing major, but it was enough. Unverified woman disrupts judicial proceedings for third time. Is this accountability or grandstanding? The post included a blurry photo of her from behind. The headline was subtle. The comments were not. Words like race baiter, plant, imposter, angry infiltrator. The attacks piled fast. That afternoon, a larger news site ran with it. Mystery Monitor exposed. Who is she really? Within minutes, her name trended on legal forums. Misinformation flew. One thread claimed she had faked a federal position. Before, another said she was connected to a political group seeking to defund court systems. The bait worked. People clicked. Her inbox flooded. One message simply read, "Sit down or we will." The personal attack had become public. The system reacted with efficiency. Her court access pass was revoked within 2 hours. Her digital clearance suspended for pending review. Calls to her office were rerouted. Someone froze her government email. She didn't respond. She walked outside into the cold light of early evening, her phone buzzing nonstop in her pocket, and stood in silence for a long time. The damage wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. They couldn't remove her legally, so they erased her proceedings. They couldn't silence her directly, so they let the crowd do it for them. But that was their final miscalculation, because they assumed she would play defense. Instead, she made a call. Just one, not to a reporter, not to an attorney. To someone whose signature she had photographed the day before. And when the line connected, she said only this: "Activate. Section 11C. Full observation. I will return with the affidavit." The voice on the other end responded without hesitation. Done. The game had changed. And this time, she wasn't the only one walking into that courtroom with something to lose. The next morning began quietly. The kind of quiet that felt like something waiting. Her car pulled up to the courthouse at 7:58 a.m. Two men in dark jackets stood near the entrance, their eyes scanning faces, not papers. She walked between them without a word, her presence already anticipated. Inside, a laminated credential waited for her at the front desk. Signed, sealed, and pre-validated with a security clearance code that wasn't supposed to exist on local systems. She placed it around her neck and entered courtroom 3B before anyone else arrived. For the first time, she sat not at the back but in the front row, just behind the prosecution's table. There was no folder in her hands today. Only a white envelope, sealed and marked with an emblem that most people in the room wouldn't recognize. As attorneys filtered in, heads turned. The intern entered, froze, and slowly took her usual seat near the back. Then came the judge. Caldwell stepped in, robe swaying, face calm. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He saw the envelope, saw where she was sitting, new, but routine as armor, and he wore it well. He began the session, as usual, voice measured, pace steady. The first witness was called. Testimony resumed. For 37 minutes, she remained still, unblinking, watching. Then, during a routine cross-examination, a man entered the courtroom from the side door. He walked with the certainty of someone who never needed to announce himself. He stopped beside her, whispered a single line, and she handed him the envelope. He stepped forward, handed it to the court clerk, and turned back without another word. The clerk read the label, froze, then delivered it to Judge Caldwell. Silence fell. The judge read the first few lines, then the color drained from his face. He stood, asked for a 5-minute recess, and disappeared into chambers. Whispers rose immediately. No one knew what had happened, but they knew something had. And then, like a signal flare in the dark, the first headline dropped online. Federa, oversight officer, issues sealed action in state court. 2 minutes later, another appeared. Judge Caldwell named in possible misconduct review. The courtroom didn't recess for 5 minutes. It paused for 21. When the judge returned, his voice cracked slightly as he resumed. But the damage had been done. Or so it seemed, because at 12:14 p.m., a new post went live from a right-wing outlet known for its speed and spin. The headline read, "Activist with ties to radical oversight agenda, target state judiciary." It included photos of her outside her office, selectively cropped, along with a long thread of half-truths about her alleged affiliations, past votes, and quotes taken wildly out of context. It even suggested she had a personal vendetta against white judges. The article went viral in less than an hour. Her phone lit up like a detonator. News vans gathered outside her building. Anonymous emails threatened to expose her college records. A clip of her walking silently into court played on loop with music designed to raise suspicion. By the time the hearing ended that afternoon, she was no longer just an official. She had been turned into a target, a symbol of something they wanted the public to fear, not just a woman watching, but a woman dismantling. Her photo appeared in 6 articles by sundown. 3 featured headlines with the word disruption. 2 called her an enforcer. 1 called her dangerous. But what none of them noticed was the real danger now had paperwork behind it, and it was already filed. In the judge's chambers, in a federal system, with a timestamp they couldn't erase while the media storm raged above ground. Something smaller was unfolding beneath the surface. The intern had been watching. Her name was Alina Ruiz, a second-year law student assigned to Judge Caldwell's court through a state-funded diversity fellowship. For weeks she had kept her head down, typing notes, archiving transcripts, recording every objection and motion. But from the first moment the woman in navy walked into that courtroom, Alina's focus had shifted, not out of curiosity, out of recognition. Not recognition of a face, but of a pattern. She had seen this play out before, though not on this scale. The subtle exclusion, the procedural gatekeeping, the strategic silence of people in power when challenged by someone who didn't fit their image of authority. Alina had stayed quiet because she thought that was the price of learning. But something about this case, and this woman, wouldn't let her sit still anymore. After the sealed envelope was delivered, Alina started pulling files. Not public ones. Internal memos, archived bench notes, logged private communications that had not been scrubbed from the system yet. She stayed late after court recessed. She searched keywords. She ran cross-references. She found that 3 of Caldwell's rulings over the past year had been quietly reversed at the appellate level, but no formal record had been attached to his courtroom logs. Then she found something stranger, a motion that had been filed, time-stamped, but never docketed. It bore the same initials as the Latina woman currently being tried. The case at the center of all this, that motion, a request for a protective order, had been sealed before it could be read aloud. And it had vanished from the tracking system. Alina took screenshots. She exported data. She backed it up on 3 separate encrypted drives. And when she came in the next morning, she left one of those drives under a folded legal pad on the woman's seat before anyone else arrived. No note, no signature, just the act itself. When the woman entered minutes later, alone again this time, she spotted it. She sat. She didn't open the pad immediately. She waited until the court filled, until Caldwell walked in, until the first motion of the day began. Then slowly, she slid the pad into her folder and did not touch it again for the next 2 hours. By lunchtime, she had reviewed the entire drive, and what she saw confirmed everything. The court wasn't just resisting her presence. It was hiding, deleting, blocking motions that could hurt Caldwell's legacy and the lawyers who benefited from his rulings. The twist wasn't that someone inside had finally helped her. The twist was that the court had become so arrogant, so insulated, it believed no one from within would ever reach out. But Alina had, and now the story had a witness, a connector. And soon, a second voice, ready to testify, not just to what had happened this week, but to everything the court had done to make sure it stayed buried. The courtroom had grown quiet again, not in silence but in tension, the kind that sat in people's chests and refused to move. By the time the afternoon session began, there was no mistaking the shift in atmosphere. Every glance carried hesitation. Each movement was measured. Judge Caldwell entered with the same composure, but his eyes darted briefly to the woman in navy before settling into the motions of routine. No acknowledgement. No welcome, just avoidance wrapped in protocol. But protocol was about to expire. At exactly 2:37 p.m., the side door to courtroom 3B opened. A man in a tailored suit stepped in, not local counsel, not familiar to anyone there. He walked with a quiet authority that came not from presence but from purpose. He approached the bench, handed the judge a sealed folder marked with a federal insignia, and then turned toward the woman seated in the front row. He gave her a single nod. The judge looked at the folder, then at him, then at her. He hesitated, lips parting, unsure of what to say. Then he cleared his throat and spoke. Let the record reflect that a representative from the United States Department of Justice has entered the courtroom with material regarding the oversight designation of this court. He paused again, looked back at her, then continued. And that pursuant to Statute 218.4c, subsection 7. The individual present in this courtroom for the last 4 sessions has done so under federal authority as a designated internal operations monitor. The room didn't gasp. It didn't explode. It froze. Completely, as if time itself blinked and forgot to resume. Every person turned toward her, not in ridicule, not in confusion, in recognition. Slowly, the woman in navy stood. Her posture didn't change. Her eyes didn't move. She did not speak. The judge shifted in his seat, discomfort crawling visibly across his expression. This court, he began, voice thinner now, was not previously made aware of this appointment. The man who had delivered the folder replied firmly. The appointment was valid. The oversight was deliberate, and the monitor was instructed not to disclose her status unless protocol violations were observed. He said nothing else. The judge said nothing else. The lawyers did not breathe. And then she finally spoke. Her voice was low, but not soft, precise, controlled. The violations began the moment I walked into this courtroom. That was all. She sat. The judge attempted to proceed, but no one heard his next sentence. The weight of her presence had finally been defined. It was not passive, it was not optional, it was not a disruption. It was authorized, documented, final. And in that moment, everything reversed. The woman who had been mocked, dismissed, silenced, had been watching with legal teeth and federal jurisdiction. The power they denied her did not need to be claimed. It had already been granted, and now it had been spoken aloud. Less than 24 hours after her identity was read aloud in court, the response began. It didn't come in the form of a direct order or formal challenge, it came in paper. A new docket was filed overnight, restructuring the courtroom's schedule. Hearings were reassigned, witnesses shifted, and the case she had been monitoring was delayed indefinitely under the justification of administrative reorganization. When she arrived at the courthouse the next morning, her federal credentials still valid and visible. She was informed by a receptionist that courtroom 3B had been locked due to scheduled maintenance. No one else had been told. The hallway remained full of attorneys and court staff, unsure whether to wait or leave. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She made a call. 10 minutes later, a secondary room was opened by order of the Oversight Division. Room 2A, she took her seat. Within an hour, Judge Caldwell appeared, unannounced and uninvited, attempting to dismiss the hearing entirely. He claimed jurisdictional conflict, alleged procedural interference, and accused her presence of causing unnecessary disruption to the flow of justice. His tone was sharper than it had ever been. Louder, edges of rage exposed beneath layers of decorum. She responded with no emotion, no accusation, only reference numbers and policy language. Every word she spoke was reinforced by documentation that had already been submitted to his chambers. Still, he refused. Refused to proceed. Refused to acknowledge evidence. Refused to allow the witness whose protective order had been buried to testify. Instead, he ended the session and stormed out. The lawyers left confused. The witnesses unsure whether to stay. The media unaware of what they had just missed. But she knew exactly what had happened. This was not a court managing its calendar. It was a judge collapsing under exposure, trying to rip the process apart before it could reach him. And then it got worse. That evening, a motion was filed in the State Records Archive titled Request for Suspension of Federal Oversight Authority. It bore his name, his signature, and a 16-page argument claiming that her presence had compromised the neutrality of the court and tainted the current trial. Attached was a request for emergency review by the State Judiciary Council. He had turned defense into attack, personal into procedural, and in doing so, he invited others to join. 2 local attorneys filed affidavits supporting his request, claiming they had felt threatened by the weight of federal review. One even alleged that she had spoken to the media outside of court, a lie designed to trigger a violation clause in her mandate. Her email account was again locked, her calendar access revoked. By morning, her physical office in the state government building had been placed under temporary audit. She was told she could not return until an internal review had been completed, but she wasn't interested in returning. She didn't need her desk, because what Judge Caldwell had failed to calculate was that every one of his retaliatory actions had been conducted in a public, documented, traceable environment. And now, the files Alina had pulled were no longer hidden. They had been submitted through the proper channel, under seal, with verified logs, and the name on the report was not hers, it was his. Judge Franklin Caldwell, accused of document suppression, witness interference, and intentional obstruction of oversight. For the first time in years, he was not in control of the court, and the system he used to protect himself had just turned inward. It started with the car. Parked outside her apartment building, she found the back window smashed. Nothing stolen, but the damage deliberate. A single folded note lay on the back seat. It read, "You don't belong here." There was no signature, no traceable handwriting, nothing to pursue except the message itself. She reported it, logged it, and moved on. That same morning, her friend and colleague from the Oversight Division, who had assisted with her clearance forms, was suspended without cause. The reason given was under review. Later that day, the security badge she used for courthouse access failed at 3 entry points. The systems claimed a software glitch. It said it would be resolved within 72 hours. By then, she knew, it wouldn't matter. But the final blow came in silence. She returned to her temporary desk at a neutral facility provided by the state, logged into her terminal, and opened her oversight report files. They were gone, all of them, not deleted, not in trash, just gone. No backup, no activity log, no trace. She froze. Hands still, eyes unmoving. Then she checked the secure server used for encrypted filing. It opened. Empty. The timestamp of her submission still existed, but the file attached had been replaced by a blank page. The deletion had been surgical. Executed from the inside. Not a mistake, a purge. The kind done by someone with admin clearance and motive. She sat there, the cursor blinking against nothingness. All the data Alina had passed. All the evidence of misconduct. The entire case history she had built over weeks of quiet, deliberate work, erased. Officially, it had never existed. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She reached for her phone and called the backup line. The one Alina had insisted she create but never use. When the voice answered, she said only one sentence. They pulled everything. The voice paused, then replied. We already mirrored it. Your drive was synced through our shadow node. She exhaled once, barely, then asked, where is the original? The answer came back without hesitation. Stored offline, triple redundant, air-gapped, delivered last night to internal counsel. You're clean, they're exposed. That was enough. She closed her laptop, stood, and walked out of the room. Outside, across the street, a black SUV idled longer than it should have. She noted the plate, took a photo, then disappeared into a government vehicle waiting 2 blocks away. Inside that car, she held the drive Alina had handed her days before. She had copied it, encrypted it, hidden it. The system had tried to wipe her clean, but she was never the only copy. And now, the erasure attempt was evidence too. What Judge Caldwell had set in motion was no longer contained to courtroom 3B. It had become a case of obstruction under federal review. The threats had escalated. The attacks had deepened. But every new strike only tightened the loop around his legacy. He had made a mistake. He had turned a monitor into a witness. And now that witness had everything she needed to bury him. The footage began as a single post on an anonymous legal watchdog channel. A clip no longer than 27 seconds. It showed a black woman standing at the courtroom entrance, holding a file. Being refused entry by a white officer who shook his head without reading her clearance. The timestamp matched the morning. The judge denied her presence. Beneath the video, a caption read, "This is what justice looks like when it forgets its oath." Within 2 hours, it was reposted on 3 law forums. By noon, it reached a journalist from the Capital Dispatch who had previously reported on racial bias in judicial nominations. By evening, it hit national syndication. Her name was withheld. But the video alone told enough. The internet dissected every second. Analysts slowed the moment when she lifted her ID badge. The officer never looked. Experts confirmed her posture, voice, and professional demeanor. Meanwhile, within the state attorney general's office, red folders began passing between departments. Marked urgent review. The clip had reawakened several dormant cases tied to Judge Caldwell's court, all dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Internal memos started leaking. Each one a blow to the administration. A respected civil rights group filed a formal complaint. Then the identity leak came. It wasn't her. It was Alina. She stood before a podium with trembling hands, eyes fierce, voice steady. She confirmed the erasure of files, the tampering of access logs, the obstruction within the courthouse. She read a prepared statement, then handed the folder to federal investigators in full view of the press. The crowd went silent. Then someone asked, was she acting alone? Alina shook her head and said, you already know the answer to that. That night, Judge Caldwell released a brief statement calling the situation a misrepresentation of court protocol, but no one believed him, especially after a former law clerk stepped forward. Then another. Within 48 hours, a former defendant publicly recounted being denied a fair hearing under Caldwell, noting discrepancies in the docket. Every new story added weight to the scandal. The system trembled. Courtroom 3B became a symbol. And she, though unnamed, became a question the state could no longer ignore. Who was this woman? The judge silenced. Why was her presence such a threat? The governor's office refused to comment. But political strategists behind the scenes began drafting, distancing language. The narrative had slipped beyond control. And still, she had said nothing. She watched it unfold from a quiet corner of a secured apartment. She didn't gloat, didn't blink. Just watched. The power she held wasn't in noise. It was in truth. And now, the truth had legs. The special hearing was scheduled quietly, without press, without announcement, just a sealed docket, marked internal. But nothing stayed hidden anymore. By the time the doors to courtroom 5D opened, 6 major networks had cameras rolling outside and nearly 100 onlookers crowded the sidewalks. Inside, the seats filled with a mix of federal observers, civil rights attorneys, and a few trembling officials who had once treated her like a rumor. Alina walked into the courtroom flanked by 2 federal marshals, carrying a binder that had already shaken the state once. Her name was now public. Her position was confirmed. But this wasn't just a reckoning for Judge Caldwell. It was for every layer that had enabled the silence. As she approached the bench, Caldwell sat with clenched jaw, his hands folded like a man pretending this was routine. The prosecutor began the session by outlining systemic procedural violations linked directly to Caldwell's chambers, including a pattern of exclusion, selective prosecution, and undocumented evidentiary dismissals. Then came the witnesses: a dismissed public defender who recounted being blocked from presenting video evidence, a clerk who admitted altering timestamps under order, a black mother whose custody hearing had been denied rescheduling after her lawyer was hospitalized. Alina didn't speak for 2 hours. Then, when the room had settled into the weight of what they were witnessing, she stood. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. She read case file numbers, patterns in court schedules, the sudden drop-offs in rulings involving defendants of color. She displayed a graph showing Caldwell's conviction variance over a 5-year span, segregated by race. The courtroom froze. Every stat had a name. Every dip in the line was someone's life. Then she opened the final folder. Her own file, sealed, redacted, denied. She placed it on the evidence table, untouched. Judge Caldwell looked up only once. He tried to speak, but the courtroom had grown too loud with silence. One federal observer stood and addressed the bench directly. "The integrity of this court," he said, "is no longer presumed. It must now be proven." A motion was entered for Caldwell's immediate suspension pending further review. Gasps rippled through the room. Caldwell refused to stand. Then the bailiff approached, whispering something, and the judge, who once refused to hear her, was now forced to listen. Alina did not gloat. She simply looked ahead. One layer of the system peeled back. One man accountable. But beneath the courtroom tiles, everyone knew. Deeper roots remained. As the courtroom emptied, the camera crews surged forward, but Alina kept her eyes down. She exited through the side hallway, past the portraits of every judge who had served this district. Her footsteps echoed beneath the faces of men who had never seen a woman like her coming. In the days that followed, the headlines ran wild. The judge's suspension was the loudest note, but it was not the story. The story was the system itself unraveling, forced to look into a mirror it had avoided for decades. But the public did not know everything. They did not know that Alina had uncovered more than bias. Behind the procedural violations, she had found financial ties, bribes disguised as donations, rulings influenced by real estate developers who preferred certain verdicts. What she held now was not just a folder of misconduct. It was leverage. A week after the trial, she was called into a federal office under no official title. The man who met her wore a plain suit, no nameplate, no greetings. He asked her one question: "Do you want to clean the rot or collapse the tree?" Alina said nothing for a long time. Then she placed the sealed folder on his desk and slid it across. She chose to clean it, but her terms were clear: no immunity, no silence. Every name comes out. The man nodded slowly. The next day, federal indictments were prepared against 3 sitting judges, a sheriff, and the head of a local bar association. Alina returned home alone that night. No parade, no headline. Just a letter slipped under her door. It was handwritten. No signature. It read, "You were never meant to survive the first day. But you did. The second part is harder." She stared at it for a long time. Then she burned it. The screen fades to black. A voice reads the final lines of her private memo, dated 3 days before the courtroom hearing. "I was never trying to win a case. I was trying to force the law to admit it forgot its name. Justice, not revenge, not comfort, justice. And it better remember me next time it tries to look away." Silence. Then the credits roll.